He 12 Angry Souls. Chapter 1, The Courtroom. The air in the room was thick, the kind of thick that made your skin stick to the fabric of your chair and your thoughts seem heavier than usual. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, each one stretching further and further into eternity. As the jurors shuffled into the deliberation room, their faces were masks of uncertainty and tension. A trial that had lasted weeks now hinged on the decision of 12 strangers locked in this room together. 12 men and women with different lives, backgrounds, and stories. Now, their fates intertwined with the weight of a young man's life. "All right, let's get started," juror number 1 said, his voice breaking through the stillness. He was the foreman, a man who had spent the better part of the trial trying to maintain order. Now, his eyes scanned the group, searching for the first sign of agreement or dissent. "We've all heard the evidence, and we've all heard the arguments. It's time to make our decision." He paused, his eyes lingering on each juror. "Guilty or not guilty? We need a unanimous decision." Across the table, juror number 2 shifted uneasily in his seat. He was a man who had spent the last few days nodding along to the flow of the conversation, never really committing to any opinion. His hands twisted the corner of his tie, his gaze flicking between the others in the room. "I still don't know how anyone can be so sure," he muttered. His voice was quiet but carried a note of uncertainty. The evidence was circumstantial at best. Juror number 3, a burly man with a heavy-set frame, shot him a look. "What do you mean, circumstantial?" His voice was sharp, his tone defensive. "We've got eyewitnesses, fingerprints, and the kid was found with the murder weapon in his hand. What more do you need?" Juror number 2 opened his mouth to respond but faltered, looking down at his hands. He could feel the eyes of the others on him, waiting for an answer. But there wasn't an easy one. I just don't know," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. A silence fell over the room. Juror number 3 crossed his arms over his chest and leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he regarded juror number 2. "What's the matter with you, man? You think he's innocent?" His words were biting, sharp as a knife. "He's guilty. They all are. You don't get to walk around with a gun like that without having something wrong with you." A low murmur ran through the room as the other jurors exchanged glances. It was clear that not everyone shared juror number 3's certainty. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the unease settling deeper into the atmosphere. Juror number 4, an older man with silver hair and a calm demeanor, cleared his throat and spoke up. "We're not here to make assumptions about the character of the defendant. We're here to decide based on the facts." He looked around at the group, his eyes steady. "And the facts, as far as I can see, are far from clear." There was a slight murmur of agreement from the others. "I agree with juror number 4, said juror number 5, a younger woman who had been quiet up until this point. "We don't know for certain what happened. The witnesses were shaky, the evidence doesn't add up in some places, and we're left with one crucial thing: doubt. Reasonable doubt." A tense silence followed her words, the weight of her statement hanging in the air. "I'm with her," said juror number 6, a middle-aged man who had been leaning against the wall for most of the trial, his arms crossed. "I mean, what are we really deciding here? The kid's life. Do we want to just throw that away because we're all too eager to wrap this thing up?" The room fell silent once again, the conversation hanging on a thin thread of uncertainty. Juror number 1, the foreman, cleared his throat and nodded slowly. Okay. We're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's just start with a show of hands. Who here thinks the defendant is guilty?" The room was still for a long moment before juror number 3's hand shot up, followed slowly by juror number 6, then juror number 8. One by one, the hands went up, some with hesitation, some with certainty. When the vote was tallied, it was clear, most of the jurors believed the defendant was guilty. But it wasn't unanimous. Not by a long shot. Juror number 2, still looking uncertain, raised his hand reluctantly. Not guilty, he said quietly. Juror number 4's hand remained down. Not guilty, he repeated, his voice calm but firm. The evidence doesn't add up, and I refuse to ignore the possibility of doubt. The eyes of the other jurors turned toward juror number 1, who was now looking at the floor, clearly deep in thought. All right, he said after a long pause. It looks like we're divided. We'll need to talk this through. One more time, carefully. And so they began. The debate would stretch on, tempers would flare, and moments of silence would become battlegrounds for conflicting ideologies. But in the end, only one truth would emerge. Was the young man guilty? Or was he, as some of them feared, simply another victim of a system that too often overlooked the nuance of human lives? The next few hours would determine the fate of a boy's future. But more than that, it would test the convictions of 12 strangers thrown together by fate, their destinies tangled in a courtroom of moral ambiguity and human frailty. As the clock ticked, each of them faced an uncomfortable truth: none of them had the luxury of knowing what was right. Not yet. The 12 Angry Souls. Chapter 2, The Cracks Begin to Show. The silence that followed was deafening, like the calm before a storm. Juror number 1 looked around the room, his eyes shifting from one face to the next, as though hoping the weight of the situation would somehow compel everyone to fall into line. But it didn't happen. There was no easy consensus. No immediate agreement. Each of them was locked in their own thoughts, some quietly fuming, others nervously wringing their hands, and a few looking downright puzzled. I still don't get it, juror number 7 said, breaking the silence with a sigh. He was a man in his late 30s, a salesman by trade, and he had a habit of speaking before thinking. It was a trait that had earned him more than a few awkward moments in his life. I mean, the kid had the gun in his hand. The witnesses identified him. The fingerprints were there. What else do you need? Juror number 2, the soft-spoken man who had first voiced his doubts, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I get all that, he said quietly. But, something still feels off to me. What if the witnesses were mistaken? What if the evidence isn't as solid as it seems? Juror number 3, the burly man, snorted in disbelief. Mistaken? You think the eyewitnesses are just making it up? What's your excuse, then? The kid's a murderer, plain and simple. He killed that man. There's no doubt about it. The tension in the room was palpable now. The heat from the argument was rising, and the walls seemed to close in on the jurors as they sat, locked in their respective corners of the debate. Juror number 1, the foreman, tried to keep the conversation from spiraling too far out of control, but it was clear the room was becoming more divided by the minute. All right, he said, raising his hand in an attempt to restore some semblance of order. Let's take a step back here. We need to approach this methodically. We've got two opposing views, and we need to explore them. Juror number 4, the older man who had spoken up earlier, leaned forward, his glasses glinting under the harsh light. We're not here to make decisions based on emotions, he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of tension. We're here to examine the facts. And the facts are that we have witnesses, but we also have a lack of physical evidence linking the defendant directly to the crime. The murder weapon was found, yes, but there's still doubt about whether he was the one who fired it. Exactly, said juror number 5, the younger woman who had been quiet up until now. We're assuming a lot here. The prosecution made their case, but we can't ignore the fact that there were inconsistencies in the testimony. And let's not forget that the defense didn't get a fair shake. The defense didn't even get a chance to cross-examine the key witnesses. Juror number 7, who had been impatiently tapping his foot under the table, finally spoke up again, this time with more frustration in his voice. You're overthinking it. We've got a case of, he said, she said. The kid's guilty. It's as simple as that. If we let him off, What does that say about us? What does it say about our justice system? Juror number 8, a quiet man in his mid-40s, who had yet to speak up until now, looked around the room with a weary expression. He had been listening to the back and forth with an almost detached air, as if he could see the bigger picture unfolding before him. "I'm not saying the kid's innocent," he said softly. "But what if we're wrong? What if he didn't do it? Can we live with that? Can we live with sending someone to prison for something they didn't do, just because we couldn't see past our own biases?" There was a shift in the room then. Juror number 8's words hung in the air, like a challenge to everyone's certainty. The other jurors exchanged uneasy glances. The anger and frustration had not dissipated, but the idea of doubt had been planted. "I agree with juror number 8, juror number 4 said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "We can't let our anger cloud our judgment. We're not here to mete out punishment, we're here to determine the truth. And if there's doubt, then that doubt must be resolved in favor of the defendant." Juror number 3 let out an exasperated sigh, his fists clenching at his sides. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. "We're supposed to let some kid walk free just because we can't decide? We're supposed to let the evidence speak for itself," juror number 2 interjected, his voice gaining strength. "If there's doubt, then there's no way we can convict. That's the law." The room grew quiet again, each juror mulling over the words that had been spoken. The conversation was shifting, slowly but surely, away from the certainty that had ruled the room at the start. The lines that had been drawn were becoming blurred, and the tension in the room was starting to shift from anger to something else, something much more dangerous: doubt. "Okay," said juror number 1, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "We've made some progress. Let's take a vote again, but this time, we're voting on whether there's reasonable doubt. If we all agree there's doubt, then we can consider a not guilty verdict. If not, then we proceed with what we've got." One by one, the jurors raised their hands. This time, however, the vote was different. Juror number 3's hand shot up without hesitation. Juror number 2 raised his hand reluctantly, his gaze averted. Juror number 4's hand remained steady, and so did juror number 8's. The room held its breath as the votes were counted. It was closer now, much closer. "6 guilty," juror number 1 said after a long pause. "6 not guilty." The room was divided. Juror number 1 took a deep breath, looking at each of them, searching for some sign of agreement, some thread of unity that could bind them together. But all he saw was a sea of conflicted faces. "We're not there yet," he said quietly, the weight of the responsibility settling in. The clock ticked on. The 12 Angry Souls. Chapter 3, Fractured Opinions. The room grew even more oppressive as the silence stretched, only the occasional rustle of clothing or the scrape of a chair against the floor broke the tension. Juror number 1, the foreman, leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose, trying to gather his thoughts. The vote was still evenly split, and it was clear that finding common ground was going to be far harder than he had imagined. 6 guilty, 6 not guilty, juror number 1 muttered to himself, shaking his head. He looked up at the group, his voice gaining strength. "We can't let this drag on forever. We need to find a way to break this deadlock." Juror number 5, the younger woman, sighed deeply. She had been quiet since the last vote, but it was obvious she was frustrated. "I don't understand how some of you are so sure," she said, turning to juror number 3, who had been one of the most vocal proponents for a guilty verdict. "There are just too many things that don't add up. It's not about what we want to be true, it's about what we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt." Juror number 3 slammed his fist onto the table, making the others flinch slightly. "I don't care about the doubt," he shot back. "The kid had the weapon, he had the motive. I don't know how you can just sit there and pretend everything's fine. He's guilty, end of story. Are you even listening to yourself?" Juror number 4 asked, his voice calm but firm, as he adjusted his glasses. It's easy to jump to conclusions when you don't stop to think about the actual evidence. The witness testimonies, the evidence, everything was based on assumptions, not facts. And facts are what we need. We can't send someone to prison just because we're uncomfortable with uncertainty. Juror number 2, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room, finally spoke up. I agree with juror number 4. I want to be sure. I don't want to be responsible for a life. The kid might be guilty, but I don't know if we've seen enough to say that with certainty. Juror number 3 glared at him, clearly not understanding his hesitation. This is a crime. A man is dead, he bellowed, his frustration growing. We can't just sit here and debate whether or not we're comfortable with the decision. We have a job to do. And that job is to find the truth, not just to convict because it's easier, juror number 8 said softly, his voice steady but carrying weight. He had been silent for a long time, but his words now seemed to hold the room's attention. If we rush to a verdict without considering all the possibilities, we fail in our duty. A guilty verdict is permanent. A life is at stake. We have to make sure we get it right. Juror number 6, who had been leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, nodded slowly. I hear you, juror number 8. I'm with you. We need to be sure. But we also need to stop wasting time and start talking about what is clear. We can't keep going around in circles. Let's go back to the evidence, then, juror number 1 suggested, trying to regain some semblance of control over the discussion. He turned to juror number 4, who had been one of the more composed voices in the room. What do you think we're missing? What aren't we considering? Juror number 4 paused for a moment, his brow furrowed as he thought. Well, for one, the prosecution's case relied heavily on the witness statements, but they were inconsistent. There were contradictions. Some of the eyewitnesses gave accounts that didn't align with others. And the physical evidence doesn't link the defendant directly to the crime scene. The murder weapon was found near him, but we don't know for sure if he actually fired it. Juror number 7, who had been almost too eager to jump into the conversation earlier, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was heading. I'm not saying we should ignore the facts. But come on, people. We're here to make a decision, not to nitpick every detail. If we start second-guessing every little thing, we'll never get anywhere. Juror number 5 turned to him, her eyes narrowed. This is exactly what we have to do. We're not second-guessing, we're making sure we're not making a mistake. A mistake that could cost someone their future. Their life. The room grew still again, the air thick with the weight of the words that had been spoken. Juror number 3 shifted uneasily in his seat, clearly beginning to feel the effects of the mounting pressure. He looked around at the other jurors, his face flushed with frustration. You can't be serious, he muttered, almost to himself. You really think he's innocent? After all this evidence, you think he's innocent? We don't know, juror number 4 replied, his voice soft but firm. That's the point. We're here to decide whether or not he's guilty. And if there's even a shred of doubt, we can't convict him. That's the law. Juror number 2 nodded in agreement. Exactly. I may not know what happened, but I do know that if there's doubt, we can't send him to prison. We can't be responsible for making that decision if we're not sure. Juror number 3 slammed his fist on the table again, his voice rising. Well, I'm sure. You all can sit here and play with words, but we have a man who was murdered. A family who will never see their loved one again. And we're sitting here debating whether or not the kid might be guilty? I can't believe this. You're right. A man's life is gone, juror number 8 said, his voice quiet but steady. But we can't make a decision based on anger. We can't make it based on assumptions or emotions. We have to make it based on facts. And if there's doubt, we have to respect that doubt. The silence in the room grew deeper, each juror lost in their own thoughts. The tension was palpable, and the weight of the decision they were about to make hung over them like a shadow. Juror number 1 cleared his throat, looking around the room. "All right, let's take a step back again," he said, trying to regain control. "We've all had our say. We all have our reasons. But we need to come to a decision." The clock ticked in the background, a constant reminder of the time passing. The room was still divided, the debate far from over. But somewhere, in the deep recesses of their minds, the jurors knew that the outcome of this deliberation would change them forever. Whatever the verdict, it would leave its mark, a stain on their conscience that could never be erased. As they sat there, waiting for the next round of votes, they all knew one thing for certain: this was no longer just a trial. It had become something far more personal. The weight of a life was on their hands, and no matter what happened next, they would never forget the decision they made that day. The 12 Angry Souls. Chapter 4, The Breaking Point. The room was growing colder as the minutes ticked by, the tension becoming unbearable. The jurors sat in silence, each caught in their own swirling thoughts. The last few moments had been full of heated arguments, passionate defenses, and growing frustration. Now, they were all waiting for the next step, waiting for someone to break the deadlock. Juror number 1, the foreman, looked around the room. He had never imagined that this would be so difficult. 12 people, 12 different lives, 12 different perspectives. They were all supposed to come together and decide the fate of a young man. But instead, they were splintering into factions, their beliefs about justice and truth pulling them in opposite directions. "We can't just keep going like this," Juror number 1 said, his voice finally breaking the silence. "We're stuck. We're not getting anywhere." Juror number 4, the older man who had been steadfast in his belief that doubt was reasonable, looked up slowly, his eyes tired but resolute. "We're not getting anywhere because we're not facing the real issue. Some of us have already made up our minds. We need to figure out how to move past that." Juror number 3, who had been the most vocal advocate for the defendant's guilt, scoffed. "Move past it? Some of us aren't letting emotion cloud our judgment. You all are just trying to find excuses for him." "No," Juror number 4 replied firmly, his voice gaining strength. "I'm trying to make sure we don't condemn someone based on assumptions. You can't ignore the facts just because they don't align with what you want." Juror number 7, who had been standing in the corner for much of the conversation, raised his hand. "I think we all need to remember what we're here for. We're not here to argue about who's right or wrong. We're here to make a decision based on what's in front of us, the facts. And right now, we don't have a clear picture." There was a moment of silence as everyone processed his words. His voice had a tone of finality to it, almost as if he were trying to force the group to face an uncomfortable truth. "I agree with Juror number 7, said Juror number 2, who had been quiet for the most part but had been quietly processing the debate. "We've got to focus on the evidence. And the evidence isn't enough to say, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant is guilty. I still don't know for sure." The quiet murmur of agreement spread through the room like a ripple in water. It wasn't unanimous, but there was a shift, a growing understanding that doubt was a factor they couldn't ignore. Juror number 3 felt the weight of it all pressing on him. He stood up abruptly, unable to contain his frustration any longer. "You people," he spat, his voice rising. "You can't just let a murderer go free because you can't be bothered to make a decision. We're talking about a life here. A man is dead, and you're sitting here wasting time over nothing." The other jurors shifted uneasily in their seats, but none spoke up. Juror number 3's anger was like a crack in the dam, threatening to break open and flood the room with the chaos he was holding back. "I'm not saying he's not guilty," Juror number 8 spoke up, his voice calm, but firm. "I'm saying that we have to be sure we're not making a mistake. If there's any doubt at all, we have to let him go. That's the law. We can't throw someone's life away just because we feel like it. Juror number 6, who had been leaning against the wall, finally spoke, his voice quiet but intense. We all have to live with this decision. Whether we're wrong or right, we all have to carry the weight of this judgment. We can't just rush to conclusions. We need to be absolutely sure. The room was heavy with tension. It wasn't just the pressure of the decision, it was the weight of the human lives involved, the consequences of their choices. Everyone could feel it. The silence that followed was thick, as though they were all waiting for someone to break the spell, to say something that would make it all clear. Then, juror number 5, who had been silent for the longest time, raised her hand. Her voice was calm, but there was a clear edge to it. I've been listening to all of you, she said slowly. And it's clear we're all on different sides. But there's something that's bothering me. She paused, looking down at the table. What if we're letting our personal beliefs cloud the facts? What if we're just looking for reasons to justify what we already believe instead of looking for the truth? Juror number 1 looked up at her, his eyes sharp. What are you saying, juror number 5? I'm saying that maybe we're not looking at the case for what it really is. We all have our biases, and maybe we need to set those aside for a minute. The kid might be guilty, or he might not be. But we can't decide that based on who we want him to be. We have to look at the facts. We can't let our own ideas about justice or our emotions lead us to a conclusion. Juror number 4 nodded slowly, clearly agreeing. That's exactly what I've been trying to say. We have to separate our emotions from the evidence. There was a long pause, a moment where each juror wrestled with their thoughts. Finally, juror number 1 spoke, his voice heavy. So what do we do now? Juror number 8 looked up slowly, his gaze steady. We take another vote. And this time, we vote with the truth in mind, not with what we want to believe. We have to be honest with ourselves. Juror number 3, his face flushed with anger, glanced at the others. He could feel the walls closing in on him. He had wanted to believe in the defendant's guilt so strongly, to justify his own anger over the crime. But now, as the group began to shift, the weight of doubt crept into his own mind, and he could feel it gnawing at him. I don't know if I can do this, he muttered under his breath, his fists clenching once more. Juror number 1 gathered himself and looked around the room, meeting each juror's gaze. We all have our own perspectives, but we're all here for one reason, to make the right decision. Let's do it. He turned his attention back to the group, hoping that this time, the decision would come without so much friction. He knew they were nearing the edge of something. Whether it would be clarity or chaos, only time would tell. The 12 Angry Souls. Chapter 5, The Final Vote. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point. The jurors sat in silence, their hands clenched, their eyes avoiding one another. They were tired, exhausted not only by the heated debate but by the emotional toll of this decision. Juror number 1, the foreman, could feel the weight of the room's anxiety pressing down on him. This was no longer about logic or facts, it was about something much deeper, the burden of life and death. We can't keep doing this, juror number 1 said quietly, his voice weary, but with a firm edge. We need to come to a conclusion, one way or another. We have a duty. Let's vote again. Juror number 3, who had been adamantly pushing for a guilty verdict throughout the deliberations, sat back in his chair. His face was flushed with anger, frustration, and something deeper, fear. He had been so sure, so certain that the young man sitting in front of them deserved to die for his crime. But as the arguments had progressed, as the others had made their points, doubt had crept in. It wasn't just the evidence, it was the overwhelming sense that perhaps he had allowed his own biases to cloud his judgment. I'm not changing my vote, juror number 3 muttered under his breath, his voice thick with stubbornness. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. That kid is guilty. Juror number 4, who had consistently been the voice of reason throughout the deliberation, looked at him with a quiet resolve. It's not about what we know, juror number 3. It's about what we can prove. And the truth is, there's doubt. We can't ignore it. Juror number 2, the quiet, tentative juror, finally spoke up. I still don't know, he said, his voice trembling slightly. But I'm starting to feel like maybe we're not seeing everything clearly. Maybe we've let our emotions guide us too much. I just don't know. The room fell silent again. Juror number 6, who had been unusually quiet for most of the discussion, stood up slowly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. We're not supposed to be deciding this with emotion. We're here to look at the facts. And if those facts lead us to doubt, we have no choice but to consider that doubt. It's the only fair thing to do. The others nodded, some more reluctantly than others, but there was a growing sense of unity in the room. No one was rushing to conclusions anymore. No one was ready to make a decision just to put this behind them. They had come too far to let impatience dictate the outcome. Juror number 5, the younger woman who had argued so fiercely for the doubt, turned to the group. We're almost there, she said, her voice steady. We've come a long way, but we still need to be sure. I know it's hard, but we owe it to him, whoever he is, to be sure. Juror number 1 cleared his throat. All right, he said, standing up and motioning for everyone to settle. Let's take the final vote. But this time, think about what we've discussed. Think about the doubt. If you're still not sure, then cast your vote accordingly. One by one, the jurors raised their hands. The room was tense, each person wrestling with the weight of the decision. Juror number 3's hand shot up immediately, his face flushed with anger and frustration. He couldn't shake his certainty, his gut feeling that the defendant was guilty, no matter the doubts swirling in the room. Juror number 4's hand remained down. His gaze was calm, almost resigned. Not guilty, he said softly. Juror number 2 hesitated, his hand hovering in the air as if uncertain whether to follow his initial vote. Finally, with a deep breath, he lowered his hand. Not guilty. Juror number 5 followed suit, her vote clear, no hesitation. Not guilty. Juror number 6 raised his hand with a quiet but firm, not guilty. The rest of the jurors followed. One by one, the votes were tallied, until only juror number 3 remained standing, his hand still raised. The foreman looked at the group, his voice steady despite the growing tension. That's it, then, he said. The vote is clear. The defendant is not guilty. Juror number 3 slammed his fist on the table, his frustration boiling over. You're all wrong, he shouted, his face red with rage. You're making a mistake, a huge mistake. This kid deserves to be locked up. He killed him. But the room had already made its decision. The others sat in silence, knowing that they had made the right choice, not because it was easy, but because it was fair. The doubts had been there, and they had followed them to their conclusion. The young man would not face the death penalty today. He would walk out of this courtroom, his life spared, thanks to the decision of 12 strangers who had put their differences aside to seek the truth. Juror number 1, feeling the weight of the moment, sighed deeply. It's done, he said quietly. We've made our decision. The jurors sat there for a long time after the vote was finished. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the clock and the occasional rustle of paper as they gathered their things. Each of them knew this moment would stay with them forever. They had each seen the flaws in the system, the challenges of making a decision when lives were at stake, but in the end, they had done their duty. Juror number 3 was still fuming, his anger unrelenting. He stormed out of the room, the door slamming behind him. The others exchanged glances but said nothing. The tension had broken, but the weight of the decision lingered, heavy in the air. Well, juror number 5 said softly, her voice breaking the silence. I guess we'll never know for sure if he was guilty or not. But we did what we could. And we did it by the book. Juror number 4 nodded. Sometimes, that's all you can do. As they filed out of the room, their faces were weary, but there was a sense of finality, of closure. They had done their duty, and though it had been hard, the decision had been made. The world outside the room seemed unchanged. But for 12 strangers, forever bound by this one case, nothing would ever be the same. The decision they had made would live with them always, etched into the very core of who they were. The end.